certified sommelier Beverly Crandon, and welcome to the Wine Down, where we talk about all things wine in a highly approachable way. And today on the Wine Down, we're gonna dig a little closer to my home. We're gonna get into the wines of Ontario and what makes Ontario wine so special. We've got a special one today that is close and dear to my heart, which is the wines of Ontario, where I live, Ontario, Canada. People, when they think about wine production, France, Italy, Spain, these places come to mind. And when you think of New World, you think of the United States, you may think of Australia, New Zealand, maybe Argentina. But you know what? Oftentimes people forget that we're producing wine right here in Canada. And specifically, I want to talk about Ontario wine today. I want to focus on that, as Ontario is Canada's largest wine producing province. It's about 60% of the wine production and grape growing in the country, and 68% of the exports that you'll see will also come from Ontario. When we think about wine production and we think about where, Ontario sits when it comes to latitude, it's at the 44 degrees north latitude line. And if I look at, other producing countries for wine around the world, and I look at to Europe, for example, who shares that latitude with us? So you've got places like Tuscany, you've got the Catalan, Istria in Croatia. Mind you, of course, the climate is very different there, than here, but we're at that same 44 degrees north latitude, meaning we're prime and ripe to grow grapes right here in Ontario. Ontario itself is broken up into 3 appellations. So not a foreign concept. You see that in France, with Bordeaux and Burgundy and so forth. So the same thing here with Ontario. There are 3 main regions in Ontario. You've got Prince Edward County, Lake Erie North Shore, and the Niagara Peninsula. So those are the big 3. There are others, some emerging areas, but those are the big 3. So let's just get started with what we have. So go to Prince Edward County. Let's start there. So Prince Edward County is Ontario's most northern wine production area. It was founded in, I want to say 2007 was when it was actually granted as being an official appellation in Ontario. It is very cool climate. Yes, of course, all of Canada is going to be cool climate, and Ontario is cool climate when it comes to wine production. But Prince Edward County is the most coolest region that we have in Ontario for growing wine. So much so that in the wintertime, their vines go through a process called hilling up. And here's an image of it here. Hilling up just means that I'm going to protect my canes, the lower part of the vines, by putting soil around them to insulate them from the cool weather, the cold weather. So that's hilling up. So they have to do that in the wintertime. Some wineries out there are experimenting with geotextiles to keep the vines warm in the wintertime, but that is highly expensive. It's quite the investment. So most people are hilling up, as you can see, with the soil kind of covering the lower part of the vines. One thing I will say, Prince Edward County, these wines have a distinction about them, and you can always tell them. They're distinctly mineral, and they've got vibrant acidity. You can always feel and tell if you're having something from the county. I would say Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Riesling does extremely well. And as you can probably guess from those grapes that I just mentioned, especially the Chard and the Pinot, sparkling wine production is a big thing for them. The region now has about 44 wineries and is growing. All right, so we were just north in Prince Edward County. Now I'm going to go to the second main region for growing grapes and wine production in Ontario, and that's Lake Erie North Shore. So now I'm heading south despite its name, Lake Erie North Shore. So Lake Erie North Shore is the most southern part for grape growing wine production in Ontario, and it includes an area called Pelee Island. And Pelee Island itself is the most southern point for growing grapes and wine production in all of Canada. This area is the warmest of the 3 regions we're talking about here in Ontario, for sure. And the reason being for Lake Erie North Shore is its proximity to Lake Erie and the warming effects it gets from the lake's shallow waters. And of course, abundant sunshine there. So you can expect to get more riper, more concentrated fruit coming out of that area. You know, Pelee Island, or Lake Erie North Shore, I should be saying, has a very rich history. I remember doing some research on the area a couple of years ago and found proof and evidence of Pelee Island entering their wines into world fairs, one in Jamaica and one in France. And that was in the mid 1800s, and winning gold medals for it. So a storied history. There are about 13 wineries in this area. Okay, now we're moving on to the bigger one of the three regions in Ontario, which is the Niagara Peninsula. All right, now we're talking about the Niagara Peninsula, which is by far the larger of the three main wine growing regions in Ontario. The peninsula accounts for about 90% of the grape production in the province. And as a matter of fact, those two other areas we just talked about, Prince Edward County and Lake Erie North Shore, from time to time, they will buy grapes from the Niagara Peninsula, that area, to zhuzh up their production, or whatever the case may be that the winemaker is looking to do. There are about 120 wineries in the peninsula. And so that, in comparison to the 44 that we saw at Prince Edward County, or the 13 at Lake Erie North Shore. One of the things about the Niagara Peninsula that makes it so interesting to discover, and something that I don't think a lot of people know, the peninsula, it spans a very varied landscape. And a lot of that is because of the Niagara Escarpment, which is a high elevation mountainous feature. And then, of course, the proximity to Lake Ontario and the Niagara River. There's a bunch of microclimates that are happening all within the Niagara Peninsula. So what this means is, unlike Prince Edward County and Lake Erie North Shore, the Niagara Peninsula is broken up into sub-appellations, because there's so many things happening there that from one plot to the next, you can have distinctly different tastes in the same grape. So if I think about topography, if I look at, wine sub-appellations that are closer to the eastern side of the peninsula, they may have sandy soils, where if I go to the benchlands, that's going to be primarily limestone. So imagine growing Chardonnay in sand versus limestone. You're going to get differences in that grape. And so that's why the Niagara Peninsula is broken up the way it is. The Niagara Peninsula is broken up into two big main areas, and those main areas themselves are also further broken up. So the two big main areas in the Niagara Peninsula are the Niagara Escarpment and then Niagara on the Lake. And then the Escarpment's got 6 sub-appellations, and Niagara on the Lake has got 4. And we're going to go into those and talk about what's so different there and what some of those appellations are known for. Dig into the Niagara Escarpment appellation. Now, if you're familiar with the area and familiar with Ontario, this appellation sits west of St. Catharines and goes up until Grimsby. Okay, as I mentioned, there's 6 sub-appellations here. First of which I'm just listing them off randomly. First of which is Short Hills Bench. Then you've got 20 Mile Bench, and so these benchlands, as I mentioned to you before, elevation. 20 Mile Bench, very much so known for its well-draining soils, obviously cool climate. I find here they produce really lovely aromatic white wines. And one winery that comes to mind when I think about this is Flat Rock Cellars. They produce an estate-grown Riesling called Niagara Riesling, which to me completely embodies everything that you're looking for with 20 Mile Bench. Then we've got Beamsville Bench, another bench. Beamsville Bench, known for its rocky soils. One of the things with rocks as soil, it does retain heat. Of course, it's well draining as well, and it's elevation, so we're expecting that. But it's that rock that's unique to Beamsville Bench and that heat retention. And when I think about wineries there and their production and how, the terroir really aids, I think of Kew Vineyards, and they have a tremendous sparkling wine production, which, typicity for sparkling wine is a racing acidity, but the winemaker is always looking for ways to round out that acidity. And one natural way on the Beamsville Bench is that heat retention, which helps to give you more riper fruit. It's absolutely gorgeous. Of course, you've got Creekside Shores, Vinemount Ridge, and then Lincoln Lake Shore, which is An interesting one. Lincoln Lakeshore is quite large, very close to Lake Ontario, so lovely moderating temperatures, generally a longer growing season here. But with the size that it is, you will see some winemakers use Grimsby Hillside on the label, and then below that do Lincoln Lakeshore. Grimsby Hillside is this unspoken appellation, if you want to call it that, where winemakers have started to notice that the grapes from Grimsby Hillside are definitely different and more distinct than everything else that you're getting in Lincoln Lakeshore. So there's talks of maybe creating another appellation for Grimsby Hillside. But Grimsby Hillside fruit, I find, of course, cool climate, we know this, so it's got great acidity, but it's got such lovely tropical fruits sometimes that you can get on the palate. The fruit's just got a bit more structure on the palate, but well and nicely rounded and integrated. So you've got a great, lovely, balanced wine coming out of Grimsby Hillside. So that is the Niagara Escarpment appellation. Let's move on. All right, so let's look now at the Niagara on the Lake appellation. You know, as we mentioned, the Niagara Peninsula broken up into two. We just talked about the Niagara Escarpment, and now it's the Niagara on the Lake appellation. One thing to point out about the Niagara on the Lake appellation versus the Escarpment, it is at lower elevation and closer to Lake Ontario. And because of those two things, you do find that the growing season is warmer there, at least 1 to 1.5 degrees warmer at Niagara on the Lake. So riper fruit, think that. But that area itself is broken up into 4 sub-appellations. So you've got Niagara River is one, then you've got the Niagara Lakeshore. Niagara Lakeshore was interesting. Let's talk about this one for a little bit. It is the coolest of the 4 sub-appellations, primarily because of its proximity to water and so forth, and a couple of things actually. It's about maybe a kilometer from the lake, less than a kilometer from the lake, and then it backs up against the escarpment. So you've got kind of like a wind tunnel, a gap that's there. So great airflow coming in there, keeps the region very cool, keeps the vines very cool. And so you find that you get lovely structured wines with great complexity. One winery that's there that comes to mind is Stratus. Then you have 4 Mile Creek, and I'm looking up into the area like this because I am just remembering the last time I was there and just looking at the land. It truly is beautiful. You know when they talk about rolling hills, this is it. It is exactly what you want to see when you're going out to vineyard land and you want to explore. It's gorgeous, but it's got great protection from the escarpment, and so I find one of the things I can pick up is it's a racing acidity, but it's tempered slightly. And one winery that I think of, and a wine that I think of when I think of 4 Mile Creek, is Mary Neeson and their Pinot Noir. Truly exemplary of this region. Then the 4th for the Niagara on the Lake is St. David's Bench. And that sits at the base of the escarpment. It's got north-facing slopes. That area is so fertile for production. Amazing. But one of the things that I note here is that it has an earlier ripening in the spring than some of the other areas, and a nice long growing season, again, beginning on that Niagara on the Lake side. And what does really well here because of that is Viognier. We know Viognier loves like a moderately cold, climate. It loves that long growing season. And so what we produce here in Ontario is a Viognier that gives you things like nectarine, tangerine, apricot. It's very delicious. So those are the 3 main growing areas in Ontario. You've got Prince Edward County, Lake Erie North Shore, and the Niagara Peninsula. And the Niagara Peninsula is further broken up into 2 big areas, the Niagara on the Escarpment appellation and Niagara on the Lake appellation. And those 2, because Ontario and Niagara is just so varied, are further broken down, where you have your Niagara Escarpment appellation has 6 sub-appellations under it, and Niagara on the Lake has 4 sub-appellations under it. And even within those, you find such unique wines and expressions of the same grape because of terroir, right? I will mention that there are emerging wine regions coming out of Ontario, some things you'll probably hear of soon. With climate change, it's making it possible to grow wine or grapes, in certain areas that we once were not able to. Like when you think globally, think of the wine production coming out of Denmark. Go back 50 years, was anybody thinking that was going to be the case where they'd be growing wines successfully out of Denmark? But they are, and we are too in Ontario and other areas that we never thought we would. But now let's look at the grapes that grow here in Ontario and do well in Ontario. So, Ontario, cool climate. So obviously, cool climate grapes do extremely well here. But the number one growing grape in Ontario is Vidal Blanc. And can you guess why? Ice wine production. Ontario worldwide is known for its ice wine, but we do so much more. As you've heard, we've got, climate that can do, we've got microclimates that can do so much more. But Vidal is what's used primarily to make ice wine, and so that is planted the most. Vidal also does really well with our cool winters. It can handle the weather just fine. Vidal is also being used in some sparkling wine blends. It will be added in there to add a bit more fruit, a bit more sweetness, a bit more ripeness, because Vidal does give you that ripe kind of feel on the palate. So that's Vidal. Then we have Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Franc has adapted so well to Ontario climate, Ontario soils. Some of the best Cab Francs I've had have come from Ontario. Not taking anything away from the Loire, still has my heart, love it there. But I think about Kelly Mason's Cabernet Franc that's produced here, or Norai Cellar's Cabernet Franc that's produced here. So lovely on the palate. It really is one of the champions, I think, of the grapes being produced here, grown here in Ontario. Next, you have Riesling, another cool climate grape. Totally makes sense. But Riesling can't hide its acidity, and it does well here. But I find our Rieslings also give you things like pear and some green apple, and there's a bit of a spicy note too on the finish of Ontario Riesling. Then Chardonnay, another cool climate grape, does well here. Then you've got Gamay also being grown here. Which Gamay to me is very, very juicy. I think if you've got some of the Gamays coming out of Beaujolais, there are some traits that you're looking for, like more red fruit on the palate. Gamay coming out of Ontario is a lovely blend of both red and black fruit. It adds a level of complexity. It spices it up a bit. And then Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, as you can tell, we've got these here in Ontario, so probably guessed it, our sparkling wine production in Ontario is also quite lovely. Really good things coming out of Ontario from sparkling wine, made traditional method, and some made in the Charmat method too, but a lot done traditional method, where you've seen those wines go through second fermentation and bottle for 3 to 5 years before they're disgorged. Absolutely delightful. Can stand up with some of the Cremants in the world, and dare I say some of the larger chain champagnes of the world. So that's sparkling wine production. You may have noticed that I did not mention Cabernet Sauvignon on that list. And the reason why that's important is that you see most regions planting it. Cabernet Sauvignon is the most planted red grape in the world, and it is the most sold red wine in the world. And because of that, regions plant it. They think, I'm going to plant Cabernet Sauvignon and I'm going to sell it. I'm going to ride this high. I'm going to ride this trend. But we recognize in Ontario, or our grape growers recognize in Ontario, that Cabernet Sauvignon doesn't always do so well. Cabernet Sauvignon is a late ripening grape, and so it needs a nice long growing season, and you can't always be guaranteed that in a climate like Ontario's, and so people don't really plant it. It's not planted nearly as much as some of the other grapes. Some people are experimenting with it now, but it's not one of our leading grapes. But yeah, that is Ontario wine. Take a look at Niagara and how we had to break down the Niagara Peninsula in so many ways. There's so much to discover here. So much. And there you have it. That's the wind down. Thank you for joining me today as I got a chance to talk about something that was near and dear to me, the wines right here in my own backyard, Ontario wine. Again, 68% of the production that's exported out of Canada comes from Ontario. So hopefully you're lucky enough to be able to find one of these bottles at your wine store, or if you go to a restaurant and it's on the list, order it. Give it a try. There's so much to discover here in Ontario. Cheers. today's last word is a quick one. Sometimes the best vintages aren't from faraway vineyards. They're just ready to be discovered in your own backyard. Cheers. And that's the last word.